네, 이제 다 나가신 것 같아요.
네, 지금 줌에서 모든 분 나가셨습니다. 자리에 앉아 주십시오. 네, 시간이 약간 지체되었습니다. 곧 행사를 시작할 예정이오니 장내에 계신 모든 분들은 자리에 착석해 주시면 감사를 드립니다. 자리에다 착석해 주시면 감사하겠습니다.
자, 그래서 편안하게 기다리니까, 그죠? 빨리 시작을 하자고. 다 자리 있죠? 앉아서. 저쪽으로 좀 채워요. 화면 잘 나오게. 저쪽으로 좀 채워요, 빨리.
네.
탑에서
테이블.
네. 오늘 행사에 오신 여러분들께서는 전화기를 무음 상태로 해주시면 대단히 감사를 드리겠습니다. 잠시 후에 식을 행사하도록 하겠습니다. 안녕하십니까. 민주평화통일 자문회의 덴버협의회 평화통일포럼에 오신 여러분을 환영합니다. 오늘 사회를 맡게 된 덴버협의회 정주석 간사, 그리고 오늘 옆에서 통역으로 소거해 주시는 오로라 시청 국제이민사업부 소속 송민수 씨가 되겠습니다. 다음은 국민의대가 있겠습니다. 모두 자리에서 일어나 주십시오. 양 국기에 대한 경례가 있겠습니다. 앞에 있는 국기를 향해 해주시면 되겠습니다. 국기에 대한 경례.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it
다음은 순국 선열과 호국 묵념에 대한 묵념이 있겠습니다. 일동 묵념. 바로 모두 자리에 착석해 주십시오. 다음으로는 민주평화통일자문회의 덴버협의회 국승구 협의회장님의 개회 인사 영상이 있겠습니다.
안녕하십니까. 저희 민주평 또한 지난 두 달 것이 바뀌어가고 있습니다. 이러한 상황 속에서 준비한 저희 포럼 역시 모처럼 훌륭한 패널들을 모시고 여러분 순조롭게 항의하는 감사의 말씀을 올립니다. 새롭게 하나 된
다음으로는 민주평화통일자문회의 사무처 이승환 사무처장님의 축사 영상이 있겠습니다.
한국과 미국 간 협력을 강화하는
대단히 감사합니다. 다음으로는 주 샌프란시스코 총영사관 박준영 총영사님의 축사 영상이 있겠습니다.
오디오 되잖아.
people really have affinity with Koreans. 멘트 할때 줄을 맞춰가지고 바로 그냥 이제부터는 영어를 해줘야 사람들이 알아듣고 바로 이렇게 해줘야 in the Korean Peninsula. I guess the panelists will address this issue too. Besides, I'm sure that today's discussion will help with a stronger relationship with our two countries in short and long term. Simultaneously, I hope this event will serve as a good momentum to pull the Korean Americans into the mainstream politics of the United States. Lastly, I think I have to tell all of you that I will have departed my duties by mid-November. So I guess this would be my last chance to say goodbye to you. I sincerely appreciate all of you for your strong support for the last 3 years of my stay. Thank you very much.
이상으로 모든 식전 행사를 마치고 지금부터 2020 NUAC 덴버 챕터 평화통일포럼을 시작하도록 하겠습니다. 이번 포럼은 전 주한 미 대사로 수고해 주신 크리스토퍼 힐 대사님께서 중재자로 역할을 해주시고 나머지 두 분의 패널의 기조 연설 후에 토론하는 시간으로 진행을 앞으로 하도록 하겠습니다.
It's my greatest honor to introduce Ambassador Christopher Hill. He will be our keynote speaker, and also he will be moderating tonight's discussion. And also we will have another keynote speech provided by Ambassador Kathleen Stevens and Professor Victor Cha. And after our discussion, we're going to be opening it up for Q&A session. Ambassador Hill, it's
Well, thank you very much. Can you hear me?
조금 더 크게 하시면 될 것 같아요.
Can you hear me?
Yes, very well.
Okay, very good. Thank you very much. First of all, should I begin now or?
Ambassador Hill, could you wait for a second because we cannot hear you very clearly.
Okay.
During the waiting time, I really appreciate the former ambassador, the Christopher Hill. I heard that you are the first ambassador to Korea, visiting the 1980 the massacre in Gwangju,
Yes.
the memorial site. I really appreciate that. Thank you.
very much. Thank you.
Ambassador Hill,
Yes, I'm here.
could you say a couple of words so we could see if we are good to go or not?
Okay, well, I'm here. I'm sitting in Florida and having the great honor of speaking to this conference.
Ambassador Hill, is there any way that you could adjust your mic volume?
It is at maximum as far as I can tell.
Okay. 지금 마이크는 가장 크게 하신 것 같거든요.
I have brought it a little closer to me. Does that help?
현재 잘 들리고 있습니다.
Please tell me when you'd like me to begin.
마이크 볼륨을 조금 올려달라고 말씀드렸는데요. 지금 제일 크게 돼 있다고 그러시거든요.
So I think the speakers are in Zoom. but you are trying to speak to us in YouTube language.
Mr. Hill, I think we're experiencing some technical difficulties here. Sorry for.
Yes, I think you are.
Oh, I think we are getting. I think you're good. Ambassador Hill, I think we're good.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Well, let me start by saying what a great pleasure it is to address this very substantial conference and to do it through the challenge of this technology brought on by the COVID situation. I think it is, however, a very good time to discuss Korea's future and the future of the Korean Peninsula and what we are likely to see. I'm very honored as well to have two very distinguished and very good colleagues, and I might add very good friends in Victor Cha and Kathleen Stevens join me. Victor and I were together during the six-party talks, and some 15 years ago last month, the six-party talks resulted in a first agreement, a six-party agreement, and then we kept working on it. And in 2007, we also got another agreement to implement some of what we're doing. Of course, the task is still ahead of us. I think it's been done by successive administrations. We were doing it with the George W. Bush administration. Of course, the Obama administration has made efforts, and then President Trump's administration has also tried to make some efforts. But I think it's important tonight, perhaps, to talk about some of these issues in a broader scope. For example, what in the coming years, certainly we look forward to a resolution of the issue of the divided peninsula, but we also look forward to resolution of perhaps the historical enmity between the ROK and Japan. What are the prospects for improving that relationship? What are the prospects, or what is the likelihood of a closer South Korea-China relationship, which I think is also a great challenge for both countries. And finally, of course, we need to look at what is the future of the US-Korean alliance. There is no question, I think, from an American perspective, that this alliance has served us very well. And there is obviously much to be done for the future. I can remember when I arrived in Korea, I arrived at a time when things were looking very, very difficult for the alliance. But I think we managed forward. And a big part of that, of course, was Kathleen Stevens, and when she arrived in Seoul and did so much to improve the relationship. So I know Kathleen will have a lot of thoughts on the issue of what it looks like going forward. I think we have to think about the Korean Peninsula as definitely a work in progress. I think it is going to be very difficult to foresee what is going to happen. We have a North Korea that so far seems to have no interest in the things that the rest of us are interested in a more global world, in a world where we're at peace, in a world where people don't threaten each other. So I think North Korea is going to be a big challenge in that regard, but I don't think we should assume that nothing is happening there or assume that nothing will ever change. North Korea may well change. It may well change at a time when we least expect it. And I think for all of us, it's very important to be ready for that change and to know what we need to do. I would like to kind of stop my remarks at that point. Maybe Victor and Kathleen can then have some remarks of a similar duration, and then we could have more of a discussion. And then finally, we can bring in audience participation. Does that sound okay with you? So should we ask Kathleen Stevens to give us some thoughts, and then go to Victor Cha, and then we can have more of of a discussion among the three of us. Does that meet with your expectations?
Yes. Yes, Ambassador Hill, that'll be great. So can we have Ambassador Stevenson?
Yes, I'm unmuted. All right.
There you
Okay.
are.
Okay. All right. Well, good afternoon or good evening, everyone. I actually want to tell you, because I assume that most people who are tuning in here are in Denver, and I want to tell you I'm in the same time zone as the best time zone in the world, Mountain Time, and it's great to join you even virtually. And I also just want to give a shout out to the Consul General. I'm sorry to hear that he's leaving, but I have many fond memories and appreciate all the work he's done on the beautiful West Coast of the United States for US-Korean relations. And it's great to be here with my old friends and my colleagues, and from whom I've learned so much, Chris Hill and Victor Cha. You know, I'm always kind of interested when we start a conference by saying we're going to talk about the 21st century, because I mean, I think it's a great title, but it's already 2020. We're already 20 years into the 21st century. And so I was kind of thinking about that, and thinking about, first of all, the 20th century, which some of us still remember, which was such an eventful, I mean, tragic and yet triumphant sort of century, if you like, for the Republic of Korea. And then the 21st century, the first 20 years for the Republic of Korea, South Korea, because I think, as Ambassador Hill said, we need to look at this in the broader context. For South Korea, has been a pretty eventful but pretty successful 20 years. I'm thinking of the beginning of this century, when South Korea was pulling out of a terrible financial crisis, got some things going with North Korea. We'll get back to all of that. But then when I got there as ambassador in 2008, was suffering the financial crisis and came out of that pretty well. And now here we are, you know, a decade later, and as our host already noted, we're living in unprecedented and very difficult times. But South Korea has acquitted itself very well, and I think really achieved even greater standing. I mean, over this last 20 years, when I think of whether it's 20 years, 30 years, 40 years, how South Korea, the Republic of Korea, really has solidified its place in the region and the world, not just as a strong ally of the United States, but as a country that really does overcome great obstacles, whether they're financial crises or global pandemics, or holding an election, which we're going to try to do ourselves in this country pretty soon. But it's really been a model for the world in many ways, and it's a great story to think about. South Korea has really emerged as a middle power with tremendous hard power, soft power, smart power, every kind of power, Korean power. But of course, what hasn't been such a happy story over the last 20 years has been the effort at peace, reconciliation, addressing the unfinished business of a divided Korea. And of course, this year we're reminded it's 70 years since the beginning of a terrible and brutal war, which did end with an armistice and an alliance, but also with a division that was never meant to be permanent, which now seems 70 years later to be more permanent than ever. So the challenge is great. I mean, I also recall, since when Ambassador Hill talked about he and Professor Cha in 2005 negotiating the joint statement of principles, which I think still have some principles that are important in terms of what a peaceful denuclearized Korean peninsula would look like, with reconciliation, and not only between North and South, but among neighbors and with the United States. All those things are very important. I was actually in New York then, where Secretary Rice was also negotiating that. And I'm remembering, though, in 2005, we were doing that at a time when North Korea had not even yet tested its first nuclear weapon. So here we are. We can talk about how things have changed, but obviously, like a lot of things, maybe in life and certainly in diplomacy, unsolved problems don't get smaller, they get bigger. And this one has gotten, you know, more challenging in many, many ways. But I do think, and I hope this is what we can talk about tonight, that we can learn some lessons from past experience, recognize that whether we're talking about the US government and administration or South Korean administrations, that leaders from from across the political spectrum have tried approaches aimed at more or less the same goal, which is, again, peace and denuclearization and reconciliation, and we haven't gotten there. So I think the big challenge is now, can we learn from that? Can we find a way forward? and can we sustain it? And I think underlying that, this will be my last point, is clearly one thing we've learned, and I know Chris and Victor always emphasize this very much, Seoul and Washington have to work together. Easy to say, but it really has to be put into action, and that I hope will be the approach of a new American administration starting very soon.
Thank you, Victor. Could you offer some introductory thoughts?
Sure. Thanks, Chris. So first, let me say thank you to the National Unification Advisory Council, Denver Forum, for hosting this event this evening. I'm glad to join you from Washington, D.C. By Zoom. I also want to send my regards to the Consul General of San Francisco as well. In fact, the last lunch I had in a restaurant was with the Consul General back in March before the pandemic hit. We had a nice lunch talking about all sorts of things, so it was good to see him. And then I'm really honored to share this Zoom platform with my good friends, Ambassador Chris Hill and Ambassador Kathy Stevens. I just want to say that they, in my mind, have been two of the best ambassadors that Korea has ever had. I think I see them as really true friends of Korea. I mean, even after they have left government service, both of them have stayed very deeply engaged with Korea. They're probably doing something on Korea almost every day, or at least twice a day. I mean, they've just been real friends, I think, of Korea, and that's something that I think we all should applaud and appreciate. And then I also see them as mentors, because when I served in government, I learned a lot from both of them. As Chris said, I was on the delegation for the six-party talks, and learned a great deal from Chris in terms of negotiation diplomacy. And then back in Washington, Kathy was at the State Department on the East Asia desk as the Deputy Assistant Secretary, and I learned a great deal from her also about working in Washington, working in the U.S. government. And so I'm really grateful to both of them. Just to start us off, let me just make 4 quick points. The first, I think, is that we would all agree that this is a very critical time for the future of the alliance. It would not be an understatement to say that in many ways the alliance is at a crossroads that will depend quite a bit on the outcome of our election here in the United States. I think it could go in, the election certainly could go one of 2 directions, and so would the alliance, I think, in many ways, and we can certainly discuss that. I think everybody in this room and on this stage believes that the U.S.-Korea alliance and the strength of the alliance is very important for both the United States and for Korea. There are no 2 closer alliance partners in the world today, and I'm sure we all hope that that would continue. Second, building on the point that Ambassador Stevens made earlier about Korea on a broader global stage, I think for most average Americans, they think about Korea and they think about the cultural things, K-pop and BTS and things of that nature. But Korea really has outshined itself on the global stage, and nowhere is this more obvious than in the case of how they have led by example the response to the pandemic. I feel like when we try to figure out here what we should do, whether it's trying to reach a plateau or trying to bring people back to school, I just look to see what's happening in Korea, because in many ways they are the lead indicator of how it should be done and what might be the problems or successes once it's done that way. And so, if we were holding this meeting in Korea today, I don't think we would all be on Zoom. We'd actually all be in a room and being able to communicate with each other in a way that we're not able to do here in the U.S. Third, I think as strong as the U.S.-Korea relationship it is and should be, it's at a very challenging time more broadly. South Korea sits in a very difficult region. Geography has always been both the curse and an attribute of Korea's geopolitics. But it's a particularly difficult time now because relations are quite complicated with all of the neighbors, with Japan, with China, with Russia, with the United States, and of course with North Korea. And that takes me to the fourth and last sort of initial point, and that is, North Korea just celebrated a big holiday where they showed a lot of their weaponry, but I feel like the domestic situation in North Korea is something that we need to watch very carefully, because the combination of problems in terms of natural disasters as well as COVID has created a very challenging environment for the regime in North Korea that I think we need to watch closely to see if it has any ramifications for inter-Korean relations or relations with the United States. So with that, again, I'm really honored to be a part of this, the events this evening. And again, I'm very honored to share the stage with Ambassador Stevens, Ambassador Hill.
Well, thank you very much, Victor. Maybe I will sort of be the ask the first question in this panel. And maybe I'll come right back to you, Victor, about how do you see the Japan relationship with Korea? For the United States, this has been a real challenge. We want to have a good relationship with Japan. We want to have a good relationship with Korea, but that leg of the triangle is not really functioning as well as we'd like to see. So I know there's been criticism in the past that perhaps the US should take a more active effort to try to bring them together, not through press conferences, mind you, but through some sort of traditional diplomacy. But is it a situation that might be right for some movement? We have some change of leadership in Japan. Is it something that a new administration? And by the way, I'm just going to make as our assumption as we go forward from November 3rd that there will be, whoever wins, I'll put it that way, will want to enhance the US-Korea relationship. Let's just use that as an assumption here. Victor, I wonder if you can give some thoughts on what could be done on the Japan relationship.
Sure, thanks, Chris. I do believe this is a very important relationship for South Korea. It's a very important relationship for the United States. That is good Japan-South Korea bilateral relations. The United States historically has always seen the relationship between our two key allies as a strategic whole. The U.S.-Japan-South Korea relationship as a strategic whole. The way we've positioned forces in both Korea and Japan have treated them as a strategic whole. The ability to share intelligence information is very important. These sorts of things. So it's a very important relationship, and it's one, as both Ambassador Hill and Ambassador Stevens know well, has become quite complicated, arguably at its lowest point, really since 1965, save maybe for the kidnapping of Kim Dae-jung. That was probably another real low point. Having said that, I think there may be an opportunity now that we have a change of government in Japan. Prime Minister Abe, it's a long story, but in the end, Prime Minister Abe was really an obstacle to any improvement in the relationship. And with the change of government, President Moon said some very open and positive things about the possibility for moving forward, as did Prime Minister Suga. But I do agree with, I think, what might be suggested in your question, which is that it does help if the United States quietly and behind the scenes is communicating to both sides how much we value both the bilateral and trilateral relationship, and to try to help facilitate in a way I think that's really been absent by the current administration over the past 3 years, and it's one of the reasons why the bilateral relationship between Seoul and Tokyo has gotten so bad. There are no two countries in Asia that share more in common than Japan and South Korea. But of course, there's a very deep history between the two of them that's not easily covered over, and for good reason. There's that history. But I do think there's an opportunity, particularly if Vice President Biden wins in November, because I think there will be much more of an emphasis on re-energizing and reinvigorating our alliance partnerships in Asia.
Thanks. Kathy, I think one of the big questions that a lot of the analytical community is interested in is what the relationship with the ROK and China is likely to be going forward. I mean, Koreans need no introduction to the Chinese. They have, known them for a few thousand years. But I think there's a real question of what type of relationship will that be, given some of the changes that have been going on in China, and also given some of the nervousness felt in Korea about the US relationship. That is, will Korea look to a closer relationship with China, or will it see its role as a partner in the US effort to some extent constraining China, an effort that has, I think, earned a lot of criticism, especially in Asia, but frankly, all around the world. And then, Kathy, drawing on your role as the head of the Korea Economic Institute, also the chairman of the board of the Korea Society, you see Americans' reactions to Korea every day, whether it's in New York or Washington. How do you see? Is there enough of support for really moving the relationship forward, as I think we all want to see, between the U.S. and the ROK?
Yeah, thanks. Well, Chris, as you say, and as I think everyone who's tuning into this knows very well, Korea and China do have a very, very long historical relationship. And but I think actually one of the most interesting and profound changes that's taken place in South Korea over the last decade or so is that attitudes, both kind of public attitudes and political attitudes towards China, have changed quite a bit. After that period in the 90s and through the 2000s, when the economic growth of China fueled so much economic opportunity for South Korea, I think there really was kind of a honeymoon period that the China-South Korea relationship was going to be not only economically important, but China could also play a role on the Korean Peninsula, a constructive role. And of course, the six-party talks with China chairing it was perhaps the zenith of that effort, if you like, but you may want to talk more about that. But of course, what we've had over the last few years is, a hardening of China's positions across a range of things. But Korea has, as Victor suggested, because of its geopolitical position in particular, has felt that cold hand of a China not hesitating to really put pressure on South Korea when it's not happy with South Korea's actions. And of course, one of the big ones was the placement of this anti-missile defense program, THAAD, a few years ago, and the kind of very heavy economic sanctions, essentially, that were imposed on South Korea by China. And my view is, and you and Victor would have a view on this too, is that really did change, really cooled off, and kind of South Koreans' views about what was possible with China. But still, given that, obviously, it's for South Korea, as for every other country, but especially for South Korea, an enormously important economic relationship. Geography doesn't change. It's still there. South Korea still needs China to play a constructive role if there's going to be progress on the Korean Peninsula and with North Korea. But I think it's also made South Koreans, in many ways, value this alliance, and also, I would say, value the values of the alliance. It's a little bit ironic to me, getting to the point that Victor was making earlier, that certainly I would agree that our alliance is at a bit of a crossroads, that there's been real questioning. And of course, we have a president in Washington now who has been the lead, I guess, skeptic of the value, not only the value of alliance, but of alliance values. And by that, I mean, do we really believe that we stand for something different? Democracy, open markets, trade, opportunity, human rights, and so on. And, what's wonderful to me about South Koreans is, they do believe that. And I think that's one of the reasons you see the support for the alliance being so strong. They do think that not just in a geopolitical sense, but in a sense of this is what they want to identify with this vision that we have kind of built, not perfectly, but that we have been committed to over the years. So Korea, as has been true throughout its history, is buffeted by these geopolitical forces. Right now, they feel it particularly strongly in the China-U.S. Worsening relationship. And what you hear, and again, I know there are a lot of Koreans in this audience, so I don't need to tell Koreans what I hear from them, but you hear they don't want to have to make a choice. They've got to have a relationship with China. I would argue so does the United States, but they've got to have an important relationship with China. But they really are on the side of the values that the United States has traditionally championed in our alliances and tried to champion in our policy around the world, and want to be partners in that. So I think they will want to double down on that. In terms of American attitudes or American how Korea, and I guess again especially South Korea, the Republic of Korea, is perceived. I mean, as Victor said, the response to the pandemic really is a benchmark, and I think it's widely recognized as that. And not only that, but the way that that South Korea has been able to have an election and have high turnout, combined, if you like, kind of a protest culture with a culture of voting. All those things have made South Korea, I think, really interesting to a much wider range of Americans, in addition to all those who love the K-pop and the pop culture. So Korea's also, because it responded to the pandemic more vigorously and more successfully earlier, is also poised to, notwithstanding trade tensions and all the uncertainties of the economic environment now, is also poised right now to come out of this economic recession, perhaps a little bit earlier and a little bit better shape. And I think that actually I do hear in business circles that there's a recognition of that, and it's made Korea in many ways a more attractive partner.
Yeah, I think Korea, we know from being diplomats stationed in all kinds of places. In my case, I was in Poland, I was in Iraq, different places. And you find your Korean colleague is one of the best colleagues you have, not just because of the US-Korean relationship, because generally when you meet a Korean colleague, you're going to find someone who really knows what he or she is talking about. I mean, really good quality diplomats. And then wherever you are, you might drive around, you'll see a lot of Korean signage for their companies. And before you know it, you've met some Korean missionaries. And you really realize this is a country that has a global perspective. And I can remember the previous president in Korea, a couple of iterations ago, Lee Myung-bak, trying to interest Koreans in this notion of a global perspective, and everyone say, "Oh, that's too far. That's too much in the future." But actually, it's already happened, and so I think we have a great partner. And I think our challenge, of course, is to make sure we have a government that understands that we have a great partner in Korea, and we should be doing more. And I think, especially for the issue of Korea and China, it's not for us to tell the Koreans what kind of relationship they should have with China. They need to work those things out, understanding their own history, understanding their own interactions with China. And I have no doubt that we'll come to a very similar point of view. So let me pivot to Victor's and my favorite subject, which is North Korea. I mean, you just never get enough about North Korea, I guess. But Victor, we've been talking about this as a conference on the 21st century. So Kathy points out we've already got 20 years gone, but 80 years is still a long time. What do you think, Victor? Are we ever going to make progress on North Korea in the next 80 years?
Well, one certainly hopes so. I think that I think it would be fairly safe to say that we should see something happening on the Korean Peninsula within the next 80 years. I would dare say even unification. As everyone in this room and on this call knows well, the division of the Korea is an aberration in Korean history. It's been a single country for thousands of years. And while South Korea has done enormously well since 1945, it shall always be recorded in the history books with an asterisk, noting that this fantastic growth and success came at a time when the country was divided. So I do think that unification will happen. I mean, this is a peace forum about unification. I do think it will happen. And I'm certain that we all hope it happens peacefully. We just witnessed this weekend North Korea's big party celebration, where they feel compelled to demonstrate their strength through the display of all of this weaponry. But I think behind all of those displays of strength is a tremendous amount of weakness, particularly now, because of the food problems they're having, the flooding. They had over 8 typhoons this summer during the monsoon season that has wiped out a good part of their farmland. And in addition, the self-imposed sanctions because of COVID or worries about COVID have decreased border trade with China by 70% year on year. So there are a lot of predictions of massive shortages in the North Korean economy, something like an 8.5% drop in economic growth, negative growth, which is the worst since the famine years. But as we all know well, North Korea has this remarkable ability to play a weak hand. And my guess is I'll try to do that again, taking advantage of our election, depending on who wins. But I still think that the agreements that the three of us worked on in 2005 and 2007, we really haven't seen that detailed a level of agreement since. We didn't see it really after 2007, where we were able not just to freeze North Korea's programs, but actually dismantle some portions of their program. So I think even though the six-party talks is kind of in the history books now, there's a lot that could be learned from the way that diplomacy was conducted by the United States, led by Ambassador Hill at the time. I think there's a lot that could be learned from that from any future administration that wants to pick up negotiations with North Korea.
I always felt, and I've said many times, that I think our six-party approach was not so much having 6 sides in a room talking about something, but rather it was a platform on which we had bilateral discussions, trilateral discussions, all kinds of discussions for the purpose of keeping a real focus and avoiding the possibility that the North Koreans would go shopping for different initiatives and say, well, we like the Russian plan better, because there was no Russian plan, it was the six-party plan. So I think it was the right approach. Again, I don't have any view that somehow it must always be 6 parties. It's not written in the Bible or anything. But I think we do need to keep in mind that for the US to think it can solve it by itself and leave South Korean diplomats at the airport and come back to them and tell them what happened, I don't think is going to work. And nor do I think it's going to work if we expect that we can kind of keep China out of this. And in fact, I think one of the biggest things that happened in the run-up to Singapore was a sort of rapprochement between North Korea's new leadership and the Chinese. Up until the Singapore announcement, there were very little Chinese-North Korean interaction, and then suddenly they were having a lot of it. So I hope that after November, some real thought will be given to how we can do this better. I'm not saying we have to go back to the six-party talks, but clearly it's also not a reality TV show. And I think we need to really understand that this is a big problem in the world that needs to be addressed. Kathy, you
Chris, let me ask you, can I turn around and ask you, since you're to follow up, and Victor too? I mean, the question that I get a lot, and we haven't had a chance to talk about this, is that's all well and good, and I mean, I certainly agree with it. We need to think about some kind of way of bringing in these other countries and having a sustainable kind of negotiating process. But what do you do about the fact that North Korea now has dozens of nuclear weapons and has declared itself a nuclear power? Do you give up on denuclearization or just push it down the road? That seems to be still the crux of the political issue.
I agree. I think every time an American says, "Oh, we have to accept that they have this," I think that's a good day for North Korea. I think we have to continue to pursue the idea that they could have a better future without the weapons than they have with the weapons. So I think we have to kind of be firm on that. We will see what would eventually emerge, but I think to have a situation where North Korea emerges as a nuclear power is not going to help peace and security in the world, let alone in Northeast Asia. So I think we need the North Koreans to understand that we don't accept it, and that means we're going to do everything we can do to prevent it, and that we're going to pursue all kinds of possibilities, whether it's working more closely with China on it, or whether it's having a kind of a very aggressive approach on our part, not threatening missile launches, or what was it called a couple of years ago, the bloody nose idea. I just didn't think that was really going to work very well. Victor, I know you share some rather serious thoughts on that as well. But I guess what worries me is if North Korea feels they can have nuclear weapons, it's their idea to create a circumstance where the US does not want to have troops on the Korean Peninsula. That somehow, if they have these nuclear weapons, some president in the future will say, why do we want US troops in the middle of this? And I think we need to be very, very careful about that. And so finally, I think we need a kind of step-by-step approach with the understanding that that is absolutely our position. And in the step-by-step approach, the North Koreans can perhaps come to an understanding that they can do better without these weapons.
Yeah, I'd agree. The only thing that I would add to that is in the step-by-step approach, some may see as, buying, what is it, the same horse a fourth time or something like that. But we have to understand that despite all of the symmetry sort of that we've had, whether it was in Singapore or at Panmunjom or in Hanoi, over the last 4 years, North Korea's missile and nuclear program and fissile material production has gone completely unrestrained.
Yes.
Completely unrestrained for 4 years. So for those who say step by step, it's the same stuff all over again, it's not the same stuff all over again, because for 4 years it's gone completely, they've just amassed much more, and their capabilities have grown and their technology has gotten better. And if anybody's in doubt, just look at the parade. Just look at what they showed at the parade. Even if those are only prototypes, it's a clear, not even signaling, demonstration of what their intentions are in terms of capabilities. And so that has to be capped in some way, so-called threat reduction, but at the same time, acknowledging that our goal remains the same, which is a nuclear-free Korean Peninsula.
Yeah. Kathy, any further
Yeah,
thoughts?
no, I agree with that. I guess, the other thing is, and again, I guess I pose it more as a question than or maybe a kind of a worry too, is one thing that is, I think in the past, it was more or less taboo, at least in US government, I think Korean government sort of policy circles, to talk about the presence of U.S. forces in South Korea as a bargaining chip, right? As something that we would somehow that we would withdraw our troops somehow in the context of these negotiations. I think now, given the approach that we've seen and from the Trump administration, that's very much, it must be very much in the minds of Pyongyang. And I guess I want to ask Victor too. I like it. I mean, does he worry about that? And or on the other hand, I mean, is that something that would actually make some sense? Is there an Overton window that's expanded here to where there are other things that are in the negotiating mix? I mean, we suspended exercises, which we said we'd never do. Maybe that wasn't such a bad idea. Are there some things that we actually learned that we might be willing to consider now we weren't before in this much changed environment, or is this a dangerous world we're in now?
Yeah, I do think a lot of sort of guardrails that we used to have up with regard to negotiations with North Korea are no longer there. One of them was summit meetings between two leaders. The other was talk of exercises, talking about U.S. alliance equities as bargaining chips, whether it's exercising or even troops. It's not an easy question to answer. I guess at some point, if we were close to an agreement which included a peace treaty, complete denuclearization of North Korea, truly a reduced threat environment, then you probably could talk quite credibly about whether U.S. troops should be a part of that. But I think, as we all know well, we're nowhere near that point right now. And the danger that we have seen is that, at least in the past 4 years, there's been a willingness to put those sorts of equities on the table for very little in return. And the reason for that is not because the current US administration are bad negotiators. It's because my sense is they don't value those things. We refer to them as alliance equities. They see them as burdens. And that has ramifications not just for Korea, but it has ramifications for the U.S. position in Asia more broadly. I mean, friends and partners in Taiwan, in Japan, in Australia, all over the region would be looking at what the United States did with its troops in Korea, and that would be a very dangerous situation.
I'd like to pick up one point you made, Victor, about we don't want to be buying the same horse again. And I think part of what has bedeviled us is the idea that we shift administrations and then there's very little continuity between the administrations. I think there needs to be a lot more continuity, and so that agreements reached by the penultimate administration, the last administration, will be honored by the new administration and not seen as somehow not done by us, but done by our predecessors, therefore we don't care. So I think there needs to be, I think this is a general comment about US foreign policy. We need to take some of the politics out of foreign policy issues. I realize good luck with that, but I think there really does need to be some effort to see if we can't have continuity such that the North Koreans don't feel they just need to wait out the departure of the administration. Now, having said all that, I don't really want, if Mr. Biden wins, I don't want him to fly off to Singapore and talk about beachfront condos as a solution to North Korea's nuclear problem. But I think we do need to try to kind of tamp down some of the politics between our administrations.
Yeah, and I would add to that, I mean, I don't want to see him offer any beachfront condos either. I don't think that's really Mr. Biden's line, but perhaps there is a little bit more space for him to do things that would have been criticized politically here in the U.S. Previously. That given that right, Trump did these summits, that he did all these things, that's kind of opened up a little more running room, I suppose, for some unconventional approaches. I'm not for really unconventional, but I think it gives a president from the Democratic Party a little more room. But even more important, I think, is because Biden has emphasized that part of, I mean, a pillar of his foreign policy will be to restore, revalue, refresh, renovate our alliance relationships. I think he is going to see the North Korean issue very much through the lens of how do we work this process in a way that does strengthen our alliance with Seoul. So, you know, Seoul has its own, obviously, dynamic as it comes to the last 2 years of President Moon's term. And I don't think it's going to be easy. I don't want to pretend that this is all smooth sailing, but I do think that will be the sincere kind of going in position, if you like, of a Biden administration. That it's not going to be, let's just take out the old playbook from the Obama years, but it's going to be recognizing all that has happened, not only on the North Korean front, but within our alliance relationships and American democracy for that matter, that there's going to be a real emphasis on you know, how can we find a common way to move forward, and how can we be sure that what we do does not further erode our alliance relationships. Obviously not only in the Republic of Korea, but in Japan and our presence in the region.
Yeah, and if you want diplomacy, and I think that's what you're suggesting, you do need diplomats, and you need people who are going to be trusted when they go out to do their jobs. I mean, I always felt that President Bush had my back, as did Condoleezza Rice, but I'm not sure if Vice President Cheney or Mr. Bolton at the time had received that memo to back up the negotiator. So I think we have a lot of work to do in the way we organize ourselves and the way we get our diplomats out there, give them instructions, but have them go at it and come back with the best deal. I mean, so many times, you come back with the best you could get, and then you get all this just brutal criticism as if you were just giving away everything. And I think people need to understand is it's not easy, and you don't get 100% of what you want. You kind of have to do the best you can. And frankly, if you're getting 51%, you're winning. So let me ask the conference organizers, do we want to go to questions now? I see we're almost 10 minutes past the hour.
Yeah, I think in the chat they would like us to go to questions now.
Okay, so do we do chat questions, or how are the questions going to be forwarded? Let me check my chat here. Oh, okay. So all right, well, why don't I just turn it over to whoever is taking the questions and maybe can direct them to us.
All the questions will be presented via Zoom.
Okay.
So what's the first question?
Okay.
네, 첫 번째 질문자입니다. 밴쿠버 마이애미 협의회 장익군 회장님의 질문이 있겠습니다.
So first question will be presented by Mr. Jang Ik-kwon, President of NUAC Miami Chapter.
Hello, good evening, and I appreciate the three panelists joining today in your very busy time in the election time. My question is, three of you. One, the answer will be better than three. So what South Korea, the Moon's administration, trying to restoring over your worries, the United States, all the politicians and the administrations, worries like a too far the ahead of steps work, or some kind of a necklace, the step work to restoring the relationship, to work cooperation together to country's administration. And second question will be what your advice to the NUAC member. We have 1,600 members in NUAC in America, who is definitely the favor to the United States, our traditional relationship, very importantly counting over the worries to the China, not at all. So, and this question is based on understanding 4 factors. One, when the North Korea is really under pressure of the UN sanction, and at 2017, the Moon administration try hard to restoring the relationship and bring the three parties together. And we remember the 2018, the January, February, the Pyeongchang, the Winter Olympic. The United States administration is very hesitant to joining and meeting to the North Korean delegate, but dramatically changing. We had a summit in between two countries, Korean administration in April, and we had a really historical surprise summit in Singapore in May, and it didn't go through much because of, I think, the wording understanding is really different, and the sincerity or understanding following the procedure is really different. But we had a really dream and hope at the time. So in that base, yesterday and Saturday, 75th anniversary of the North Korea, the establishing the military ceremony, the Kim Jong-un's speech in the early part, he mentioning, maybe that's a word or not, anyway, he mentioning the global, the children's health over the pandemic, and also he mentioning the South Korea, the hope, wish to well overcome. And so that is a kind of suggestion. And second, actually third part, the Hanoi, the summit, the Trump, I think President Trump is not as understanding the South Korean people or North Korea, the Kim Jong-un's upset about the result. But I think that Trump is still waiting of his last question. I'll wait a couple of weeks, few weeks of your answer with all the data, what you hide out, the commonly and other, the plutonium. With those data, if you come, then we're counting you as a sincerity and ready to talk. And I think it's still, there is a stage of halt and stop. And fourth, last one. And North Korea, I understand.
Oops.
Century, 16th century, they want to keep that regime. So those kind of understanding, I want your suggestion to the Moon's administration and to NUAC members what to do.
Okay. Can we, Kathy, you want to start?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for all that. There's a lot there. I don't want to answer too extensively. Honestly, I have to say, I think that overall, the Moon administration, President Moon came into office, right, with less than 24 hours between the time he'd been elected and taking office. And I think it was a couple of months after President Trump had come to office. And, I think in many ways, he was kind of trying to play catch up the whole time to an American president who is, unlike any American president I think anyone's ever seen. So, I think given all that, it was very, very challenging. And I do think that the Moon administration really tried in kind of actions as well as in words to emphasize the importance of denuclearization, to work together with the administration. But I think that there was a fundamental problem in that, as we have already talked about, President Trump himself just doesn't sort of see things through an alliance lens. So I think it was really, really challenging. So I think going forward, rather than looking back, but going forward, the challenge for the Moon administration for the next 2 years in dealing with a new administration, and again, I'm going to assume that it's going to be a Biden coming in. On the one hand, I think it will get back to what Ambassador Hill talked about, of a more normal, if you like, diplomatic relationship where, there'll be more normal consultations and a process and it'll be more comfortable. But I think that there's going to have to be a lot of understanding on Seoul's side that a new American administration is going to have a very full plate. It's going to, need a little time. And it's just maybe, to find some areas where, Seoul can move forward perhaps on some humanitarian issues or inter-Korean issues, but it really has to be in a way that trust is built with a new administration, and we work together. And I think to the extent that, those of you here in the United States who are following us can continue to kind of help reflect that, that would be very helpful.
I'll just say a couple of things. In addition to what Kathy said, I think that the first is that, and we talked about this a little bit earlier in the conversation, that one of the things that Trump has done is he has removed some of the things that Kathy referred to as taboos in terms of negotiations with North Korea, particularly the high level meetings. And so so I think that, everybody had all sorts of expectations with regard to Singapore. What we learned afterwards through Bolton's book and other things was that this was probably the most important meeting between political leaders in South Korea's post-war history. And the US president was completely unprepared for it, just completely unprepared. But it did open the idea of higher level meetings. And so if there was some way to combine like the sort of expertise and the details of previous negotiations, like the six-party talks, with additional higher level representation on all sides. I mean, that's in fact what was done during the Iran deal, right? You had actually people at the secretary level who were negotiating, Ernie Moniz and Kerry, who were negotiating, so that the negotiator doesn't have to come back to Washington and find that everybody is trying to shut down what was being done, in Beijing, when the actual principals are heavily involved in negotiation. That's the first point. The second point on what an organization like this with 1,600 members can do, I think, as Kathy said, of course, staying very well informed on all of the issues that matter for Korean Americans and for Koreans in general is quite important. But the other and the most important thing you can do, and I think my colleagues would agree, between now and November, is vote. That's the most important thing that you could do right now. So.
Yeah, I think Victor and Kathy have covered it, but I really, yes, everyone needs to vote. I think maybe Koreans maybe should try to make sure, I know that's been done in Denver with congressmen, but try to make sure US elected representatives, hear the perspective of Korean Americans, and try to make, I think as a country, we need to get a lot more literate on some of these foreign policy issues. And for anyone who thought that the North Korean issue could be solved by a summit in Singapore or a Singapore fling or thing, this is far more complex than just having a meeting and someone hits the side of his head with the palm of his hand and says, okay, I get it, and then that'll be the end of the problem. I mean, and there needs to be, we often talk in the COVID situation of trusting the science, listen to the scientists. I think there's room for expertise in foreign policy, and I don't think people should be expected to get it in an afternoon, which is why you usually don't want your leader to be the first one, because the leader should essentially come in at the end of the process, having seen the reports and seen the experiences of the negotiators going forward. So I think the United States, we have a lot to learn on this, and I think we might as well start in Korea. And I'll say one other thing: if for people who worry about the deterioration of the China relationship, or phrased another way, worry about the direction of the China government and the things that it's doing and where it's going, I think we do need to find some patterns of cooperation. And I know that China does not share the aspiration for a North Korean bomb. And so I think we ought to see what can be done with China to see if we can move this forward. So, boy, it's getting late, but I'm sure one more question or so. What?
Actually, we have 3 more questions, so now we need to ask everybody to be really precise and simple for the questions and answers as well.
네, 다음 질문입니다. 밴쿠버 협의회 정기봉 회장님의 질문이 있겠습니다.
So next question will be presented by Mr. Jung Ki-bong, President of NUAC Vancouver chapter.
안녕하십니까. 반갑습니다. 첫 번째 질문 드리겠습니다. 한반도 문제를 보다 효과적으로 다루기 위해서 한국이 주도하여 상설 다자국 회의체를 새로 만들어야 한다고 봅니다. 여기는 남북미 비롯 여러 나라가 포함됩니다. 북미 혹 한미가 만나면 늘 같은 얘기가 반복되고 진전이 없었습니다. 미국을 포함한 다른 여러 국가가 이 다자 회의에 참여하면 개선의 여지가 있지 않을까 합니다. 사무실은 한국 영토 내 판문점 이남에 두는 것이 안전 등 여러 이유에서 좋을 것 같습니다. 물론 비용은 한국이 부담합니다. 어떻게 생각하십니까?
So the first question is, to better handle the Korean Peninsula issue, I believe South Korea should initiate a permanent multilateral council that could bring many stakeholders together, including both South North Korea and US. When North and US or South and US meet, same talks has been repeated with no progress. If other countries participate in a multilateral meeting, there could be room for improvement. The office should be located within South Korean territory, south of Panmunjom for safety and other reasons. South Korea should also pay for the expenses. What is your opinion on this?
I'll start and then turn it over to Victor and Kathy. But you know, I think ideas like this ought to be carefully studied. I think it's the kind of these are constructive proposals. There'll be a lot of questions. Do the North Koreans want to have that? What will be the rhythm of the negotiations with a permanent structure? Does it accomplish what we did at the 6-party talks, which was to make sure that China is involved in a positive way? So there are a lot of questions, but I don't think, given where we are, that there should be any shyness about making proposals of this kind, nor should there be anyone thinking that we shouldn't take every proposal seriously and give it proper study. So, Victor?
Yeah, I'd agree with that. I think there is. I think this is a time when different ideas about how to approach this very difficult problem should all be put on the table. There were some versions of multilateralism in the past, so-called 4-party talks that involve the 2 Koreas, the US and China. What's being proposed here is not 4-party. I would also say that in the 6-party format, as both Ambassador Hill and Ambassador Stevens know well, what was very useful about the 6-party format was that there were many meetings that took place on the side. These meetings were held in Beijing, and we would go there sometimes for 2.5, 3 weeks at a time. And they were, and the picture that everybody in the newspaper saw was the first meeting of the day, where we'd all sit in that big room, and then everybody would read their initial statement. But then after that, there were all these meetings that were taking place at the complex, bilaterally between the US and China, the US and South Korea, North and South Korea, trilaterally sometimes. And that, I thought, was the real beauty of 6-party talks. I mean, that there were many different types of meetings that were taking place, all for the purpose of achieving one goal, which was, a denuclearization deal that would be amenable to all parties, particularly North Korea. So I entirely adopt the idea of multilateralism. I think it's an important way to do this, and formats like what's been described, as well as 6-party, are useful venues for doing that.
Kathy?
I agree, Mr. Jung. I think this coming up with these kinds of ideas is very timely and is the kind of thing that I hope the members are doing. Joe Biden clearly understands these kinds of things because he's followed American foreign policy for a long time. And notwithstanding our political rhetoric, which is usually the US has done everything, as Ambassador Hill knows well. I mean, in my diplomatic career, Victor mentioned the Iran talks. I cannot think of truly not a single negotiation that the United States maybe led, but that did not involve multilateralism, whether it was a contact group in the Balkans, whether it was getting the Canadians and the Finns and Northern Ireland. I could go on and on. There's always that element and it's a little bit forgotten, I think, sometimes in Seoul and in Washington when it comes to North Korea. But I think a reminder of that would be very timely, and good ideas are much needed.
Yeah, I attended the Dayton Peace Accords on Bosnia, and it was at a U.S. Air Force facility in Ohio. And the concept that Ambassador Holbrooke had, by the way, it was 25 years ago this month. The concept that Ambassador Holbrooke had was everyone stays there until we have a deal. And so we just stayed, days, nights. We didn't know if we were going to get one, but we finally, after some 21 days and nights, got one. And we did it with European delegations, including a Russian delegation. We had Croatians, Bosnians, Serbs, and of course the American delegation. Everyone was there going crazy, but finally getting the deal. So, all right, next question.
야, 두 번째 질문하겠습니다. 한국이 종전선언을 요구하지만 미국은 동의하지 않습니다. 만일의 경우 미국이 북한을 공격하는 것은 휴전하에서가 종전 후보다 절차와 방법이 더 쉽습니다. 저는 단계적 종전선언을 제안합니다. 여태까지 한반도 전체의 종전선언은 미국을 포함한 유엔군의 부담 때문에 이루어지지 않았으므로 일단 처음에는 한반도 일부를 포함한 종전선언을 해서 종전지구, 즉 평화지구를 만들어보자는 것입니다. 이 개념은 과거의 개성공단이나 금강산 지구를 미국과 유엔이 승인하는 확장된 개념입니다. 예컨대 처음에는 한반도의 3분의 1이 포함되었다가 몇 년 후 확대하는 방식입니다. 이 종전지구는 재래식 군사력은 주둔할 수 있으나 핵무기는 불용되며 유엔군 주둔도 또한 필요 없습니다. 이 개념은 미국의 입장에서도 국제법에 위반되는 핵이나 ICBM 등 전략무기 등은 종전지구 밖으로 빼내기 때문에 유사시 타겟의 범위가 축소되어 군사전략상으로도 미국의 유리한 전략이 될 수 있습니다. 결코 미국에 나쁘지 않다고 생각되는데 어떻게 생각하십니까?
So next question. South Korea wants an end of war declaration, but the US does not agree. It is easier for the US to attack North Korea under an armistice than after an end of war declaration. I would suggest a phased end of war declaration because the declaration of end of war in Korean Peninsula was not feasible due to the position of the UN forces, including the US. So the idea is to create an end of war zone or a peace zone on a part of the Korean Peninsula. This concept is an expansion of the past experiences of Kaesong Industrial Complex or Kumgang Tourist Zone, which the US and UN endorsed. For example, 1/3 of peninsula could be designated as the zone and be expanded few years later. In the zone, we can still keep conventional forces, but should prohibit any nuclear weapons. Also, the UN forces do not need to be stationed there. So what is your thought on this proposal? So I'm gonna ask just one of the panelists to answer this question due to time constraint.
Kathy, Victor, either of you?
Well, okay. I would say, first of all, the idea of the kind of 1/3 peace zone or neutral zone, I'm not sure what the correct way of referring, that I had not heard expressed before, and it's very interesting. I would say this about I mean, the end of war declaration, peace regime, peace treaty, and so on. Again, these are ideas that actually were included in 2005 in the negotiated principles that we would look at these. And, there's been a lot of thought and work done on it in and out of the US government, including consulting with Korean colleagues over the years. So my sense right now is that I wouldn't look at it so much that the US, because we're going to have a new administration, or even the Trump administration opposes it. But I think it is one of these issues where the time is ripe now to have a full discussion of what the sequencing and what the approach might be to this kind of peace process side of the negotiation.
I mean, we have never opposed it. The issue is where in the sequencing does it happen? And ideally, we want to see it in the context of a denuclearized North Korea. So not have a major peace deal with a nuclearized North Korea. So, last question.
네, 다음 질문자는 지금 한국에서 접속을 하신 분이 계십니다. 토머스 셜터 씨의 질문이 있겠습니다.
Next question will be presented by Mr. Thomas Schuler, joining us from Korea.
Yes, hi. Start my video. My concern is with the end of COVID-19, or as we reach the end of COVID-19, we will be having to send medications and personnel into North Korea to assist as a humanitarian effort. What, if anything, will be in place to prevent manipulation of this by the DPRK government?
I would just say that this issue comes up all the time on humanitarian assistance, and usually you have safeguards, and the safeguards have tended to work. And so I see if we get to something like that, I don't see that we wouldn't be able to put together something that makes sense. And I think anywhere you can do something about COVID, you should. So
yeah, absolutely.
Victor, Kathy, any?
Yeah, the only thing I would add is that I think there was a good template for this in I think it was in 2007, 2008, where there were food shipments that went to North Korea, but it was negotiated by the United States as representing not just the US, but also the NGOs and the World Food Program. So the United States sort of was contracted out to do the negotiation for everybody, all the groups that might have been involved. And in that way, it made it hard for there to be manipulation of the system by trying to work different deals with different groups. And my guess would be something like this if it involved the WHO, South Korean NGOs, US NGOs, and Gavi and all the other vaccine groups, that it might be something that would be negotiated. The terms might be negotiated as a group rather than individually.
Okay.
Okay. Sounds good to me.
네, 지금 저희 유튜브 채널뿐만이 아니라 지금 많으신 분들이 질문하시고 싶은 말씀들이 많으신 걸로 알고 있지만 저희들이 시간 관계상 저희가 모든 질문에 대답을 하지 못해 드리는 점 대단히 죄송하게 생각을 하고 있습니다. 저희가 마지막으로 질문 하나를 더 받을까 합니다. 이곳에 계신 분 중에 한 분께 질문을 받겠습니다. 네, 김 기자님의 질문이 있겠습니다.
So the last question will be presented from actual participant of tonight's discussion. So let me introduce Ms. Lee Ha-din with a weekly focus.
So because the time has been passed for a while, so I'm going to make it quick. I'm going to ask this question to Ambassador Catherine Stevens. So depending on the outcome of the presidential election, what kind of a change of North Korean policy would you expect? Would you expect dramatic difference between, would you expect the dramatic difference of their approach for each candidate?
Well, thank you. I mean, yeah, I would expect that a Biden administration would continue, as we discussed, to have the goal of denuclearization, complete denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula, along with an effort to strengthen the alliance with South Korea and to promote, together with Seoul, a process of peace and reconciliation on the peninsula. I think those would be the broad outlines. And as we discussed, I think that it would have a greater emphasis and a greater understanding of the centrality of America's alliance relationships in the region, in particular with South Korea in that process. You know, I think we've seen now the Trump administration, and we see what the major strands of it are, which, I mean, we've seen the limits of a top-down approach, but it would also, I think, in a second term, be characterized by a much worsened China, the alliance structures.
Thank you.
네, 대단히 감사합니다. 오늘 저희가 처음으로 시도를 해본 이 유튜브 라이브 스트림의 진행상 조금 매끄럽지 못한 점 깊은 사과의 말씀을 드리고 많은 양해를 바랍니다. 오늘 다시 한번 크리스토퍼 힐 그리고 캐서린 스티븐 전 주한미국 대사님과 빅덕차 교수님의 귀한 시간을 내주셔서 다시 한번 감사의 말씀을 드립니다. 우리 모두 박수로 한번 감사 인사를 드립니다. 네, 저희 민주평통덴버협의회는 계속적으로 우리의 조국 대한민국의 평화 통일을 위해 공공 외교 및 차세대 통일 인재 육성에 더욱더 힘쓰는 협의회가 되도록 노력을 하겠습니다. 오늘 평화통일포럼에 참여해 주신 모든 여러분께 깊은 감사의 말씀을 전합니다.
So we would like to express our gratitude for all the participants and sharing your time and your great opinion on this matter. And we really appreciate your special relationship with Korea, and we really appreciate you all. Thank you so much. And I know there was some technical difficulties, but please, we're asking for your we would like to apologize for the delays due to the technical difficulties, but thank you so much for your time and your effort to spend your Sunday night with us. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
네, 그럼 이상으로 2020 덴버 협의회가 주최한 평화통일 포럼을 마치도록 하겠습니다. 대단히 감사합니다.